Thank you for being here. I'm glad to present my work. This is a summary of the PhD work I've been doing for the last 6 years with Alain and Stéphane, who are both here. I'm going to talk about the computational frameworks that we've built, not just to model theories, but actually to help people build theories. It's something that we've developed both for psychological theories and then more recently for even cognitive neuroscientific theories. Okay, so we'll talk about motivations, we'll talk briefly about communicating automata, we'll explain to you our refinement process and our general methodology. I'll give a first application that is relatively simple. Then we'll talk about neuronal systems, which is where we talk more about the neurocognitive theories, and the application, which is the global neuronal workspace theory, which is one of the leading consciousness theories today. So the motivations. Do you know about the replicability crisis in psychology and the social sciences?
Yes.
Okay, some people are saying no, so I'm going to explain. Basically, about 10 years ago, some researchers realized that about half the literature in psychology is based on experiments that do not replicate. Half is a lot. And in this other half, there's a significant part, so I think it's half of the half, so about a quarter, which only replicates on students from the Silicon Valley. I'm half exaggerating, but these were the people who were, having a $20 bill to go do some experiments and answer questionnaires and so on. So there's this big crisis in psychology. It looks like maybe 75% of the literature is actually not so good. And people have been thinking about what is the issue, what can we solve, and statistical methods are being developed, new experimental paradigms, etc. There's a lot of things about data collection, but what some researchers said is that verbal theories are not very specified and are not very precise. And that is due to the fact that they are verbal. So I'm going to explain this in a minute. I love this idea that science has, among many roles, has two core roles, which are one, to build theories that are precise and ambiguous, non-contradictory, true, and two, to test these theories by designing experiments, collecting data, validate or falsify, etc. Building good theories isn't just for an abstract pleasure of having great theories. It actually helps with data collection. If you have a precise theory, you'll be much more capable of collecting data than if you don't. And these two, of course, interact. Theories get experiments, experiments refine theories, etc. And what I do during my PhD so far is only here. It's about building good theories. And that's what we're going to talk about in this next hour. So, as I said, there's a big crisis, but this crisis was expressed by some psychologists already 40 years ago. They were saying that psychological theories are not very well defined. So they're not sufficiently specified. As I said, they're verbal theories, so expressed with natural language, most of the time. It's difficult to validate or falsify something that is imprecise. If you have imprecise theory, you will make imprecise prediction. Very difficult to falsify an imprecise prediction because you can always say, yeah, well, it's kind of true, right? Because it's imprecise. There's like a leeway. There's a wiggle room. And there aren't so many methods to actually take a verbal theory and translate it into a formal model. So many researchers have called for formal models in psychology, but this is actually quite new. Most researchers who do this use differential equations so far, but I haven't seen one person who talked about automata 10, 15 years ago, but otherwise there's very little formal methods. There's a call to create frameworks and methodologies for theory specification and theory building in psychology, and to specify existing theories. So to take a theory that isn't very precise, and to make it more precise. These two things is exactly what I do during my PhD, is answering these calls. Okay, so let's continue with the motivations. Imagine that a lion enters the room right now. You probably are going to have a stress response. You're going to ask yourself, am I in danger? What can I do? All these questions. And we wonder, can we formalize the stress response that you will have when the lion enters the room? So you're attending your seminar, you're resting, suddenly a lion enters the room. You ask yourself, am I in danger? If you realize, yeah, I'm in danger, then you're going to ask yourself, what can I do? Can I run? Can I hide? Should I play dead? What's the best option here? Can we formalize these processes? Now, I'm going to give you a second example. Has it ever happened to you that you're working so hard? It's 12:25 or actually 11:30 for this lab. You're working so hard, and then someone comes to you and says, hey, do you want to go for food? But you actually don't hear them. You heard them, but you didn't hear them. And then you actually hear them like a couple of seconds after they spoke. Raise your hand if it's already happened to you. Most people, right? This notion of a stimulus that arrives to you but that doesn't come into conscious immediately is called a pre-conscious stimulus. So again, can we formalize the conscious pre-conscious stimulus? You're in deep focus, you're researching. When somebody talks to you, you're still focused. Then the stimulus enters the pre-conscious state. And then at some point you realize you've heard it. Can we formalize these notions? And of course, that's what we're going to do. I'm going to show you today how we did this. Okay. So what is our contribution? We created a methodology to take a verbal theory, a set of sentences, more or less precise, and translate it into a formal model. And then after with a method to check that it's faithful. We have a first framework with communicating automata, synchronization, refinement, model checking. We wrote a paper on this that is still under review. And we applied this framework to create a formal model of the transactional theory of stress, which is one of the most studied theories of stress in the world. And then we created a second framework, which is to do with neuronal systems, which are communicating timed automata with tokens, refinements, and then we created a formal model of the global neuronal workspace theory. So I'm going to explain all of this to you in the next 40 minutes or so. Okay. Why theoretical computer science? I think it's really important. It's not because we're computer scientists that we should just assume that it's really great. Why not differential equations? And there are several reasons to this. First, we wanted a formalism that is open to all kinds of psychological theories, cognitive, behavioral, even neurocognitive, so we could even go down to the level of neurons. We want to be able to handle large systems. We want modularity. We want to modify, compose, refine easily, but we want it to be formal. We want to do step-by-step simulations, to do formal verification of properties, and comparison of models, formal and automatic comparison of models. Well, theoretical computer science gives us so many tools to do all of these things. And that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to leverage this 50, 60 years of literature that allows us to do all of this.
Why are differential equations non-theoretical computer science?
I think classically it's more considered to be part of mathematics.
We can prove things about it.
Yeah. Well, in mathematics we can prove things.
No, formally with machines.
Yeah. Well, I think some theoretical computer science can be applied to differential equations. It's just historically speaking.
What areas of computer science rely on differential equations, or heavily rely on differential equations?
What kind?
What areas of theoretical computer science?
Other physical systems, the big deal.
Okay.
Yeah, even hybrid automata.
Yes. There's quite a lot of literature on even machine models that talk about have behind differential equations of some form.
Okay.
The issue of continuum versus discrete, you mean?
Yeah, I think I'm talking more about the standard model of theoretical computer science, like automata, Turing machines, Petri nets, etc. Like this hasn't been used so much in this way, and there are indeed more discrete models.
We can add, and sometimes we add in hybrid automata differential equation. It's not the problem of this, but many laws in psychology are expressed as an equation, and they have not a methodology for refining, composing. This is more the case.
Also, when you look at a psychological theory or even neurocognitive theory, very often you'll see notions of states and transitions that emerge, a mental state, a psychological state, and you move from one to another. Well, what are the models that really encapsulate the notions of states and transitions? Finite automata and all of their extensions. So this is the reason why, one of the main reasons why we focus on these models from theoretical computer science, to which we can add differential equations, and we actually hope to. So it's not to exclude differential equations, it's just, for us, we wanted to focus first on the models of automata and their extensions. Okay, so imagine a very complex theory of stress, which says that you're in danger, that you're stressed when there's danger, and you're not stressed when danger leaves. Well, that very difficult theory is formalized by this very complex system of automata, which is only one automaton. Okay, so what we use is communicating automata. So first, everybody here know what is a finite automaton? I left this slide just in case, but I'm guessing yes. Okay, so everybody here know what it is. Now, in psychology, there's a concept from the 80s, which is called the modularity of the mind. Fodor conceptualized the human mind as a set of interacting modules. And that's exactly what we want to do. If there are different modules in the mind, perception, memory, attention, emotion, etc., we want them to communicate between one another using communication semantics from theoretical computer science. So we use multiple handshake, which is sometimes said multi-way rendezvous. Basically, I have three automata. This is a system. Automata A1 and A2 can synchronize on letter B. When this happens, the letter B are taken, the transitions labeled by B are taken simultaneously by these two automata. Also, it's a blocking condition. A1 cannot take B alone. Whoever has letter B has to take the transition simultaneously. And this blocking condition helps us with, for instance, refinements, which we'll explain later. Now, because it's a methodology for theory building, when you're building a theory, you don't always know what you're going to build next. And sometimes you know that something happens, but you don't know what it is. So for this, we use the letter tau, which in this context means I know a behavior is happening. If a transition is labeled by tau, it just means I know a behavior is happening, but I don't know what. And when I'm refining, I can then give meaning to this tau transition. So in this first formalism, tau transitions don't synchronize, just very easy. I take a tau transition whenever I want. Okay, so that's an example. There are two automata. I'm in states NA and F. I take the tau transition on the left, I arrive here, and now I can synchronize on the stress transition. Before I couldn't, because both automata have to take it. Take this transition, I come back here. Okay. So remember, let's just come back 1 minute to our purpose. We want to take a verbal theory, express it in natural language, and translate it into a formal model. And for this, we wanted a methodology. So we created a methodology that has different steps and that uses refinements. So how does it work? We created refinement operations, like for instance, I have a system of automata, I add or remove a transition, I split a state, I make an initial state non-initial, I add a basic automaton, I unite automata. I'm not going to go into the huge detail here, but remember, tau means I don't know. So here I'm going to give more precision to this transition by adding a transition which has the same incoming and outgoing states, but labeled by B, for instance. And then I can do that again. Here is the operation of splitting a state. So when you start with your theory, you think there's only one state, then after further investigation, you can actually realize this state, one state is two states. So you take Q, and Q becomes Q1 and Q2. You can see that all the properties are preserved, incoming and outgoing transitions, the fact of being an initial state or not, etc. There's 8 refinement operations in the first framework. I think there's 9 or 10 in the second. I'm not going to give them all because they're quite technical sometimes, and It's just to give you an idea of how it works. But what's interesting is we've shown that the refinement operations, such as we've defined them, allowed us to create any system starting from a trivial system, which is a bit of a sanity check for us. Our refinements, it's a completeness property. Our refinement operations are sufficient. Then, what we've proven is that when I refine a system, the refined system doesn't have new behaviors. So the formalism says there's a non-trivial relation such that if S prime is a refinement of S, then the runs of S prime are related via R to runs of S always. R is surjective here. But basically, in theory building, sometimes people say, oh, I know that this system is more precise than the other. Well, now we've proved it. We've used the formalism to prove that property so that when people build their theories, if they use our refinement operations, for sure, there is no new behavior. So what is this general methodology? I start with a trivial system, something where everything is possible, there's no constraints on it. I choose a concept, and then I model it with refinements. So in the verbal theory, for instance, if the verbal theory talks about stress, so okay, I'm going to take the word stress, one concept, what it means, what it's its mechanism, I'm going to model it. Then I do that again. I either develop the concept of stress or I model another concept. Do it again, I do it again, until I end with for a model that seems to encapsulate as much as I would like at this point in time. It seems fair to me. And this is where we can use verification. So how do I do that? I come back to the verbal theory expressed with words, and I translate this verbal theory into logical formulas. CTL, LTL, whatever. We use CTL star just for, it was easy to do that in our context. And then we check if the system actually satisfies these formulas. So we take the verbal theory, we translate it here into automata, here into logical formulas, and we see if they match. This gives us like a double way to verify that what we're doing is indeed faithful to the original theory. So how do we use verification? So I take a verbal theory, I create a formal model of it. This is what I just explained to you. I verify that it's faithful, but we want to be able to put it in a model checker. And then if our theory is complex enough and has real world data, what is the, is the states called burnout reachable, right? Analyze actual properties of the system that have real world applications, maybe for psychologists, psychiatrists, etc. Yeah, we call that psychological model checking. So I take a system, I take a sentence, and then I try to model it, right? I oftentimes have modeling choices, and that's actually an important part of our methodology because there are three ways in which modeling choices appear. Sometimes two modeling choices, two models are completely equivalent. They fit the text at the same way, they would match perfectly the logical formulas both. In this case, we just choose the simpler, if there is a simpler. Otherwise, we flip a coin. The second time is when the theory gives no information on inevitable steps. And this actually happens a lot because when you create a verbal theory, you don't necessarily have in mind all the little steps. For instance, in the stress theory, nothing is said about what happens when we're sleeping, when we fall asleep. But if you want to consider a system that is whole, you have to describe this. In the consciousness theory, they don't explain how a content exits consciousness. But we have to describe this for our model to actually be a model, because there needs to be a moment where content exits consciousness. And sometimes it's ambiguous. And this is no fault of the people creating the theory. I think it's just natural language. Sometimes words, depending on the context, mean different things. And sometimes it's easy to interpret in two different ways. Now, type 2 and type 3 of modeling choices have a very strong theoretical usefulness. We've seen under specifications, ambiguities, and both of them help us to prompt new research questions, which we can then transmits to the psychologists or the neurocognitive neuroscientists, and they can see how to answer or if they adjust their model or not. But this is how we have the interaction between creating theories and collecting data, and how these two things interact. So principles for modeling choices: if I have equivalent options, I choose the easier to understand. And generally, since I have different modules, if a concept is only relevant to one module, usually it will be a state of the module, just because it doesn't have to interact with the other. But if it's a shared concept, it has to be a letter, because then it will be able to synchronize with different modules, right? Because it has a communication synchronization semantics. Okay, now let's go into a direct application. So the transactional theory of stress. What is the transactional theory of stress? So this theory has over 100,000 quotes about it, about the book that explains the theory on Google Scholars. Incredibly widely studied theories. Even in the last 6 months, there were a couple thousand more quotes on it. So it's still very, very studied. The basic principle is that up to the 60s and actually up to the 80s, when we talked about stress, stress was either defined as something from the environment, like a certain event is a stressor, like a cataclysm, or losing your job, or losing a family member, or having a lion enter the room, right? Stress was talked about just the environment. But then they realized, wait, two people react very differently to losing their job. So is it only about the environment? Another definition that they had is that stress is a physiological response. So you measure stress by measuring the heartbeat, the skin conductance, all these different physiological parameters that we thought. And then Lazarus said, no, actually, it has to do with both the person and the environment. That's the only way I can explain that when two people lose their jobs, they have two completely different responses. Some people become really, really stressed and anxious, or some people feel relatively okay about it. And they describe the transactional theory of stress, which is the following. If you're a person with your commitments, beliefs, values, your goals, your ideas about life, what you want, what you don't want, and this person is inside an environment. What the theory says is that there is an evaluation from the person of the environment based on all their internal parameters. And a situation is deemed stressful if two things happen. So remember the lion who enters the room? There are two questions that I will unconsciously or consciously ask myself to become stressed. The first one is, does it endanger my well-being? Which is called primary appraisal here. The second question is, what are my resources? And the answer to these two questions will determine my level of stress and actually the quality of my stress, which type of emotion, etc. So, for instance, it's a bit of an extreme example that is just for life, but if I think that I'm really good at running away from lions or fighting lions, I will be way less stressed than if I feel completely helpless. And same in front of losing your job. If I feel like I'm really good at finding jobs, I won't be so stressed, right? This is why the second question is actually, at first, we don't know how important it is, but it actually does matter. When we're stressed, we start to enact efforts to deal with the situation. Efforts are of two types: internal efforts to deal with my emotions, and external effort to solve the problem. This is called coping. So remember the example of the lion. And now we're going to do the methodology. So remember, we start with a trivial system. We just have one automaton with one state and one tool. Remember, tool means I don't know. So what this means is there is one state to the world, and there is behavior, but I don't know what it is. So it's supposed to be very generic. Yes.
Sorry if I'm nitpicking on the language and the terminology, but you keep on saying, I become stressed, or when we are stressed, or something.
Yeah.
But what I gathered from your presentation of the word of Lazarus is that stress is actually something that's distributed over the individual and the environment. So really, under that framing, it wouldn't make sense to say that a person is stressed, but more that stress exists in this relationship. Maybe there's a better way of saying it, perhaps, but it's obviously simpler to talk about an individual being stressed, even if that isn't really the case.
So, sorry if I didn't formulate it correctly. The person evaluates the environment and himself and what they call the transaction.
Okay.
But it's still the person who evaluates it and becomes stressed.
Okay.
Yeah, absolutely. It's something that relates to the person.
It relates to the person, but about its location
Is in the person.
Oh, okay. I would gather from your explanation that its existence is distributed over the person and the environment, because the loss of a job exists in various bureaucratic and administrative systems as well as within the individual's mind. So, yeah, but sorry.
Yeah, so that's the earlier definitions of stress, where we consider stressors, like events that cause stress. Here, we don't consider that anymore. We consider the internal evaluation of the person with regards to the events.
Okay.
That's what matters. Does it make sense?
Yeah.
Okay, so I start with my trivial system. Yes.
The trivial system is for the individual, like it's the thing which the system models is the individual, like the subject of like it is a single person which is modelized by the system, or
This trivial system?
Yeah.
It actually doesn't really model anything. So for instance, this will be refined into a person, an environment, etc. It's actually just saying that at the most trivial system, we just say that there's one state that's maybe just the state of the universe, and there is observed behavior, but we give no precisions to it. Okay, so I use my refinement operations to model the following sentence. Cognitive appraisal is an evaluative process that determines why and to what extent a particular transaction or series of transactions between the person and the environment is stressful. So cognitive appraisal is a process. Okay, I'm going to say there is a state where I'm doing appraisal here. And then there's a second module, which is very complex. So it's very simple, but it's not refined yet. Since we have refinement operations, we start with something very simple and then we'll refine. But what I'm saying here is this module evaluates stress. And because we have synchronized transition, the module that is called cognitive appraisal can only receive the letter stress or no stress when it's in the state appraisal. Okay. I add the environment. I consider the environment to be a finite state system that I depict here. That sense, so when I'm in the state of the environment called X or brackets X, I can send the message X to the cognitive appraisal automaton. Okay, so now we go to a more refined version. Every time it's a refinement. We use the refinement operations each time. So here is when I'm awake. This NA, I didn't describe it to you, but it means I'm asleep. Non-awake and also non-appraisal. But this wasn't described in the theory, so I just had to choose. And I just said, okay, I'm not appraising when I'm asleep. I wake up. Here, let's say a lion enters. So the environment changes to the state where there is a lion. Here is primary appraisal. Remember, primary appraisal is this question in your head of, am I in danger? If I realize I'm in danger, I take this transition here. This transition here synchronizes with this new automaton, which will deal with secondary appraisal and coping. This double arrow means that there are as many transitions as there are letters called C of a set big C. And when I take the letter S, I will non-deterministically choose one coping strategy to evaluate it. So I become stressed, and here I'm like, okay, should I run? I evaluate here the strategy called run. Once I've evaluated it, either I think that it's a good strategy with letter G and arrive here, or I think it's bad. But in both cases here, I come back here. But here, if I think it's a good strategy, I'm going to act on it and I'm going to run. And running here will have an effect on the environment. Right? So here I'm describing to you the algorithm that is encoded in these automata, which formalizes the process. Here, we've modeled a very simple decision-making strategy, which is saying, the moment I think that a strategy is good, I act on it with this strategy. Of course, it's way more complex than that. There are so many decision-making theories, and they're obviously way more complex than that. We've done something very simple because that's not the point of the paper on stress. But what's interesting here is I could have put any decision-making theory. Literally the one that I want. I could even add another automaton that says decision-making that has an operation and then sends it here. Okay, so here is the run of the system. I start here. I'm primary appraising. The line appears. I'm still appraising. I realize I'm stressed. I wonder, can I run? And then I realize it's a good strategy to run, and then no more line. Okay, so as I said, we can add so many models. We can imagine a course of action and its results. We can memorize coping strategies. We can add decision-making theories. We can calculate the stress level based on the goals, values, and beliefs on the individual. We've actually modeled all of this in our longer paper. But what I personally like with this formalism, it's the modularity. I can add any compatible cognitive theory. Actually, I can even add an incompatible one, and just my runs won't make much sense. But I can just add whatever I want. So now, I told you that the last step is verification. If I'm happy with my model, so I'm just going to show you how we do it. I take a sentence from the book, and I'll translate it into a logical formula. Cognitive appraisal is an evaluative process that determines why and to what extent a particular transaction or series of transactions between the person and the environment is stressful. So I always have that when I'm doing appraisal, this implies that I will appraise weak until, and I use weak until because we're on finite runs. So I don't have a choice. If I use an until, it falls very often. Until either I fall asleep, or I realize that the situation is stressful, or I realize that the situation is non-stressful. You're going to tell me, yeah, falling asleep is not there. Yes, but from what they say, appraisal happens during waking life. So if I fall asleep in the middle, according to another sentence, I should stop appraising, and it's okay. So this is why I did this here. Then the second part here, appraisal is largely evaluative, focused on meaning or significance, and takes place continuously during waking life. So several things on this sentence. First, when I'm appraising, it's equivalent to being awake. And that's something I've had to decide because they don't say anything about what happens outside of waking life. So this is just a modeling choice where there's a hole in the theory. Okay, so I fill it with a certain understanding and there's not more we can do. Now, just to show you the kind of things that we encounter, what does continuously mean? Clearly, it's a process that has discrete beginnings and ends. So is it every 5 milliseconds? Every 200 milliseconds? What is it exactly? Or is it every time something appears in the environment? So this is where something is not very precise. And when we model, we're forced to see it because we're forced to give precise meaning to transitions and states. So when we formalize a theory, I've already explained this, 3 types of results emerge. We see ambiguities, like I've just shown you, holes in the dynamics, like I've also just shown you, and theoretical properties implied by the theory that are not in the text. So by modeling, we're like, well, actually, these 2 sentences together force this behavior to happen, which I actually haven't seen in the text. And that's really interesting because it maybe, we'll see, I'm not a psychologist or a neuroscientist, but maybe it gives you insights on the nature of the psyche. All of this prompts research questions and helps with theory refinement. Okay, so here are a few ambiguities that I found in the theory of stress. In the definition of stress, there's a big ambiguity. At first, they say that it's both feeling in danger and lacking resources. And then after they say that it's either harm, loss, threat, or challenge. I'm not going to go into details. There's an ambiguity in the order between primary and secondary appraisal. As I said, what is the meaning of continuous? Ambiguous. There are plenty of under specifications. What happens outside of waking life? How is a scoping strategy evaluated? Do we imagine an outcome? Do we imagine several outcomes? For how long? None of that is given, and we had to make a model up ourselves. Okay. So now let's go to neuronal systems, which is the formal tool that we developed for the neurocognitive theory of consciousness, which is called the global neuronal workspace theory. So, does anyone here know the theory a little bit? Not at all? I'm guessing not at all. Okay, great. So it's one of the leading theories on consciousness today. And I'm going to give you some of its basic principles, and I'm going to show you how we model them. What this theory says is that in the brain, we distinguish two different computational spaces. One computational space is local and specialized brain processors that process certain types of information, like evaluative information, perception, memory, motor functions, etc. Auditory cortex, motor cortex, visual cortex, etc. First computational space, processors that are distributed, just acts, without necessarily communicating, they could. And then in the middle, there's another computational space that they call the global neuronal workspace. It's widely distributed in the brain, and it has very long neurons long axons, neurons with long axons that can connect different parts of the brain. Now, it's a theory of what conscious and unconscious processing are and what's their difference. Unconscious processing happens all the time. There's actually way more happening in unconscious processing than there is in conscious processing. For instance, emotions are constantly processing, motor preparation, perception, etc. They can happen locally if these modules are connected. For it to become conscious, first, there needs to be attention on it, and there needs to be what we call an ignition. Ignition is when the workspace selects, mobilizes one or several modules to say, okay, I'm going to broadcast your contents everywhere. And what the theory says is that conscious contents, what you're consciously aware of right now, is what was broadcast to your brain to vision, action, speech, what you can reason about, what you can think about, what you can use to plan. That's what's conscious. It's what's being globally broadcast. Well, guess what? The term broadcast is clearly a term that also exists in the theoretical computer science literature. So we wanted to use some of the formalisms of communicating automata to model all of this.
So you mentioned attention as well.
Yeah.
So ignition and attention are two requirements.
Yes.
And are you saying anything about what's modulating or directing attention here? Or is that
it's
intentionally left open?
No, it's intentionally left open. It's not a theory of attention, but we will discuss how attention affects the process. Yeah. So we need a richer formalism. Our communicating automata were insufficient. We need time windows. We need activation of multiple brain areas with timing constraints. And we need senders and receivers. Remember, the modules are mobilized and send information that is then broadcast to many other modules. That's the theory. That's when consciousness happens, is during that big broadcast. Okay. So we extended time automata. I'm guessing most people here know what are timed automata. It's an automaton with clocks. You have state guards. Here, I can only stay in this state as long as the clock X is below 1. When I take a transition, I can have a transition guard, and I can do a clock reset. The clock reset says when I take this transition, the clock Y goes back to 0. This is extremely useful if I want to measure how much time has passed since I've taken this transition. Okay. So what is a neuronal system? It's a tuple. I have a set of clocks, X. I have a conscious alphabet where each letter is a feature. So something that can be together with other things that could form a conscious content. So for instance, the color blue, the shape square, things like that, textures, etc. I have an unconscious alphabet for signals that can be broadcast and shared unconsciously. I have G, which I call the GNW automaton, which is some kind of controller. And I have the modules. So this models, remember this computational space at the center that does the broadcasts? And this models the localized brain area that are modules. So the states of G are all the numbers from 1 to n, where n is the number of modules. Every module has one number in the GNW automaton. And the state of states of the system is all of the states of all the automata. This automaton and all of these. Now, a configuration is a tuple of a token function and a clock valuation. Clock valuation assigns to every clock a positive, non-negative real number. So configurations are not states here. Configurations are basically token functions. So here I have all of these states, and at every state I assign a number of tokens. Here there are 0, here there are 5, 3, 1. And we have a special state called source. This special state called source has omega tokens. Omega just simply means a number large enough. So I can take this transition D, if it's fireable, I can take it as many times as I want, 1 billion times if I want. Because omega minus 1 is always equal to omega. And the state source is very useful to model brain activations and deactivations that are not necessarily transferred to something else. The state source is also what will make it that neuronal systems are actually relatively close to petri nets, but I'll explain that later. Okay, so now how do neuronal systems model the theory? Basically, there are two synchronization mechanisms. One is conscious, so we'll call it conscious broadcast, and the other one is unconscious broadcast. So, as I explained, the global neural workspace can mobilize certain brain areas to broadcast the contents while suppressing others. So how do I mobilize an area? I will mobilize area of module M1 if I have at least one token here. If I have 0 tokens in M2, it's not mobilized. Here I have at least one token, so it's mobilized. Here I've mobilized module M1 and M3. Mobilized modules are the ones that I mobilize so that they can share contents for this contents to become conscious. They are exactly the modules that contribute to a conscious experience. So now I'll show you about conscious broadcast and conscious processing. The personal content is conscious when it is globally broadcast to many other local brain areas, making it available for verbal report and motor control. That's what I explained to you earlier. What is conscious is what is broadcast by the global workspace via the mobilization of modules. Let's pass on this sentence. Okay, so I have the global neural workspace automaton here with 3 states. State 1 is activated, state 2 as well, so module M1 and M2 are mobilized. Module M1 will send me the information behind me. That's when I'm in deep work, really thinking about my proof, and someone behind me asks me, hey, do you want to go for food? This module that treats spatial location of sound can send me the message behind me. The fact that there is a double exclamation mark means conscious broadcast here as well. That's the module that deals with semantic processing of sound. And what this module understands from the words I hear, from the sound I receive, is the word food. Now, when you're aware of a blue triangle, you're not aware of blue and triangle as 2 separate things. Everything is integrated and coherent. They call it multimodal, correct? So that's a part of the theory, is that modules send information that are not integrated, that are separate, but when you receive it, they are integrated. So how did we model this? When you receive conscious content, you receive it as the set of all the features that were sent. So I don't just hear, oh, there's something behind me, and oh, I hear the word food. I hear the word food, and I feel it behind me at the same time. This is what is modeled here. Conscious contents appear as coherent multi-feature, multimodal objects. Now, unconscious broadcast is much more classic. I take a signal, and there's one sender, many receivers. All the receivers and the sender have to synchronize together to take the transition. This is much more standard than the one previously. We have just a condition that all the receivers, all the automata that have a receiver transition have to take the transition, which is again the blocking condition we talked about earlier. So what can we model with neural systems? Well, any theory that has conscious and unconscious components, decision-making, emotion, reasoning, perception, memory, you name it. So remember, we used refinement before. It was more simple. There was not all of these complicated transitions and all of these times, state guards and stuff. So we added we had the similar operations, and we adding a clock, strengthening a state guard, transition guard, adding a clock to a clock resets. And it's the next slide, but we have the same results as before. We have a new theorem which says that for every neuronal system, there is a Petronet that is in transitive simulation with the untimed transition system of S. So basically, when we remove time, neuronal systems are fairly equivalent to Petronets from these two propositions. For every Petronet with empty initial marking and arcs bounded by 1, there exists a neuronal system such that its untimed transition system is in dissimulation with P. What is nice with this is that reachability and coverability will be decidable for untimed neuronal systems. So if we have something very complex and we want to ask the question, okay, can this conscious state be reached? Model checker could decide that. So we have the same proposition and theorem as before. Our refinement operations are sufficient to create any system. And we have proved that refinement amounts to constraining. When I refine, I don't have new behaviors that appear. Yeah, it's just same as before. Okay, just a little claim. We're not claiming that our tool, neuronal systems, can be conscious. We're not also claiming that they can't. We actually don't really have a position about this. The only purpose of this is to model systems. And I'm asking this because artificial consciousness is actually a real emerging field today in science. And when I gave this presentation last Friday, that was one of the first questions. Do you think neuronal systems can be conscious? Because it's a computational system that tries to reproduce what consciousness happens, how consciousness happens in the brain. So they say, if you're a computational functionalist and you think that consciousness is just a computation, then neuronal systems could be conscious. I hope we haven't created some kind of conscious thing. I don't think so, but it's not the point of our work. That's the main point here. Okay, so now let's do an application. So we begin with a trivial system with nothing. And then I add an auditory module. So here, the double circles means that for all x in the set stim, stim is a set of stimuli, squares with red colors and purple triangles, whatever, you name it. Or somebody talking to me, just a sound wave. For each x in this set, I will have this exact structure. This is the transition that represents the module receives the stimulus. Module receives the stimulus and processes it for a certain amount of time. Cannot process it for too long. There's a state guard here. Then it will send unconsciously, there's only one exclamation mark, it will send unconsciously to connected modules when it says, okay, this person is talking about food. I write here, once it's processed, I can send a double exclamation mark, which corresponds to the conscious broadcast and the person becoming aware of that. Now, in the theory, there's strong stimuli and weak stimuli. So for instance, if I show you an image for only 20 milliseconds, you will not see it. you won't become aware of it, although your brain will process it. And there are all these amazing experiments that show that if I show you an image for a time where you can't actually see it, it will affect your choices in questions right after. So your brain actually processes it. So if we talk about conscious and unconscious processing, we have to model these subliminal stimuli, which are here. It's exactly the same structure as before, but with weak here and with strong here. When it's strong, I can do a global broadcast and it can become conscious. When it's weak, I cannot. So now we're coming to our example. You're so focused on your work, somebody talks to you, you don't hear it immediately. It's about attention and preconscious stimuli. Attention selects signals and amplifies them. A preconscious stimulus is when there's a strong signal, but no attention brought to it. My attention is fully on my work. I just don't hear it. This is a chart from one of the papers that we've modeled, where you can see there are 4 states described with strong and weak stimulus, and attention and no attention, and the different ways that the brain is activated. Well, these 4 states are exactly here. Well, not exactly, because here there's an ambiguity. When there is attention and a stimulus is strong, it's not necessarily conscious, according to the theory. So there is another state here. This was one of the ambiguity in the theory. So here, I have an attention module. When the state is activated, I can direct my attention to a feature. I can say, okay, I will focus on the square over there. I will focus on the meaning of the sound that I hear over here. So it's like before. Here, I receive the stimulus by the module. Then it can become preconscious. When I become preconscious, this clock here, T buffer of X, goes to 0. And the preconscious state, where it could enter my awareness, but it doesn't yet, has a limited time. If I stay focused on my research, I will not hear my colleague. Maybe it's happened to you. It's definitely happened to me. So that's modeled by this state guard over here. And then when I'm preconscious, I can go on the path to consciousness if I receive attention from this module, which will trigger this transition. I arrive here. Here, it's a strong stimulus. It's attended to. And now we can pass the conscious threshold and arrive here. This model gives us a formal notion of what is preconscious and of what is conscious, which is what we wanted to do at the beginning. So a run of the system that represents this. I don't know if it's necessary to describe it to you. I start with all tokens in source, and then I take a state transition. I'm processing it. Then I send it unconsciously to connected modules. The signal enters the preconscious state. I wait for 300 milliseconds. I stay preconscious. Then, oh, I receive attention towards this stimulus. It becomes strong and attended to, and then here it passes the conscious threshold, and I finally hear my colleague, and I tell them, great, let's go through. So this model isn't a representation of what happens at the level of neurons, but you could refine it to the point where it is. But imagine that the billion of neurons for each state. It would be a very complex system that I could probably not show here, but maybe one day. So it's just to give a perspective on what we're doing. So there were some, we've seen some ambiguities in the theory. When is a content conscious during ignition? When is it broadcast? When is it received? For how long? This isn't very precise in the theory. There's an ambiguity about the conscious threshold. Also some other specifications that I've actually already talked about. I'm going to hurry because I'm running out of time. In this theory, there is a property that emerged. Like these two sentences, logically speaking, there needs to be this behavior, but this behavior didn't appear anywhere. I think it'll take me a bit of time to explain it to you in details, and I'd rather have questions and feedback. So I think I'm just going to move to the conclusion here. So we've done 2 frameworks to model psychological and neurocognitive theories. We have a methodology to translate verbal theories into formal models. We have formal models of theory of stress and the global workspace theory. We've detected ambiguities and their specifications, new research questions. We have some mathematical properties. We want to create a merging operator to combine different theories. We want to compare theories between them, create a cognitive architecture, and we love to create a graphical interface so that cognitive neuroscientists or psychologists can just press, create a state, here's a transition, send it to a model checker, how does my system behave, etc. Yeah, we tried to find an intern to do this. We didn't find anyone that was, it just didn't work out. If you know of anybody that would be interested, we would definitely enjoy this. On June 10th here, right after the Séminaire Ouvert, there will be the first workshop on computational psychology, organized by Alain and other other researchers, where we will talk about this among other things. And I will give a training sessions, actually two, here on the day before, and maybe one online, to teach neuroscientists, psychologists, etc., how to formalize theories using our methodology. So, yeah. Okay, that's it. Thank you very much.